The intention within this presentation is to build on some of the things that Dan's talked about, but focusing quite a lot on the limitations of satellite data. So I really want to drill down and get specific about some of the limitations and also some of the advantages of satellites. So taking a slightly deeper technical dive than Dan did. I'll also be talking about scenarios where we believe that satellite data is useful. So we've got some suggestions to help with decision making about where satellites might be useful within your workflows. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit more. Dan's already started talking about this, but I'm going to talk a bit more about how we're using satellite data to support the BNG process. So to start with, just a word or two about map impact. So we've formed as an environmental services company. So the focus for us is providing novel environmental data feeds. So what we really pride ourselves on is trying to get technology into people that haven't used it before. And the way we go about that is through collaboration. Everything we're doing is really highly collaborative, and hopefully that will come out through my presentation and then in the discussion that Dan and I have later on. I think that this is really important to summarize really where we think we are and why we formed the company. It's really the backbone of why we founded Map Impact. What we're seeing is that after the passing of the Environment Act, there are a number of new legislative requirements coming in. So biodiversity net gain is becoming mandatory from January 2024. And this is alongside what's been described as a crisis in the sector, whereby there aren't enough ecologists to support the new legislation that's coming in. So what we're aiming to do is bring in new tools and new technology that can support ecologists and make them more efficient in their work. So what we're seeing in the future is that there will be other legislation coming. So this biodiversity net gain legislation is coming in January and then throughout the early part of next year. But then we're seeing other environmental legislation coming in the UK, other parts of the UK as well as England, around water and air. And then we're looking at other parts of the world as well, and we're seeing equivalent mandatory legislation beginning to come into force in other places. So again, emphasizing some points, a lot of the things I'll be saying will be just picking up and emphasizing points that Dan has already made. And I think this is really important. It's a really important starting point to say that satellites are a tool. They're one of the tools and they're not the complete answer. So they complement many other things, but they cannot provide the full end-to-end service on their own. So we see a lot of statements from people about what satellites can do, and often the capability can be overpromised in what they can deliver. And what we're trying to do within Map Impact is really be upfront about the limitations and provide confidence scores and accuracy statements with everything we do, so that you know how reliable the data is as you're using it. So I tend to start presentations with this, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's really a myth that you see through various Hollywood films. These are extracts from programs such as Homeland, where a satellite might be tasked to follow someone, and it might be zoom in and read the newspaper that they're holding live. That simply isn't the case. Satellites are not constantly watching us, they're not hovering over us, and they can't zoom into that level of detail. What we typically see is that satellites, and the satellites that we're using, are following what's called a sun-synchronous orbit. So what that means is that satellites are constantly passing around the North and South Pole, and the Earth's rotating underneath them, and they're following daylight around the Earth and just essentially taking a photograph straight down of the Earth and building up this archive of information. So they're taking photos and passing around the Earth as they go. And what we see with the satellites that we're using are called Sentinel-2. They're operated by the European Space Agency. And there are two of them, and what that means is that we potentially get imagery about 2 times a week. So we get imagery quite frequently everywhere on the planet. So these satellites pass over everywhere about twice a week. The other point that's worth making here is that satellites have a very these particular satellites have a very wide, what we call a swath. So they have a very wide field of vision on the ground. And each satellite image covers a width of about 290 kilometers. So it's capturing a very large area in a second as it passes over each part of the planet. So I made the point that these satellites potentially capture an image twice a week. However, one of the key limitations when you're using satellite data, and indeed any form of remote sensing data from above, is cloud. And I think it's really this is really important. And we've looked at some we've been looking at quite a lot of data over the last few months, and looking at data from the archive of the previous few years. And what we found is that there isn't a single month over England that's been cloud free for the last 3 years. And I don't think that surprises anyone. But it's just something that we have to consider. So although this satellite's constantly passing over, we actually don't get as many images as 2 images per week. We get far fewer than that because of cloud cover, essentially. Now, there are ways that we can overcome cloud cover with satellites. So the satellites that we use are what are known as passive satellites. So these satellites are constantly orbiting the Earth, and they're relying on light. They're relying on sun being reflected off the Earth, and that satellite will capture that reflection, and that's what it's taking. It's essentially taking that as a photograph, working the same way as a camera. There are other types of satellite in orbit which are called what are known as active satellites, and these are using technology such as radar, whereby they're sending a signal down to Earth and then receiving that back. And what that allows is for us to cut through cloud. So those particular satellites are passing very frequently. They can cut through cloud. However, they're not receiving the same amount of information that we get from a passive satellite. So we're constantly, when we're sort of looking at all of this data, and I'll be saying this throughout this presentation, we're constantly having to consider trade-offs between different things, different parts of the technology. So when I talk about these passive satellites and how they're working, and I talk about them being a photograph, what you can typically see with your eye is what's called the visible part of the light spectrum. But the light spectrum is very large. So this represents the whole light spectrum. And with satellites, we're actually able to view other parts of the light spectrum beyond just that section that's available to the visible eye. So when I look at this is a really nice schematic that sort of demonstrates what this looks like. So you've got the wavelengths of light at the bottom, and what we're able to do is interpret different parts of those wavelengths in order to understand different things about the environment. So there's some examples across the top here, but what these spectral signatures and the spectral properties of this data allows us to do is understand different things about vegetation. So we can understand things about vegetation health, vegetation performance, and a variety of other things by looking at this data in lots of different ways. And it's quite interesting. You know, I mentioned the idea of this trade-off, and what we've got at the bottom here is some satellites that are operating with hundreds of spectral bands. So they break down that light wavelength into hundreds of different signals, which is great. That's allowing us to really do some really in-depth interpretation about the environment. So, for example, we can begin to do things like identify types of shrubs or types of trees from the satellite when we have that sort of level of information. However, the trade-off is related to resolution, and I'll come on to that in a second. So typically what we see is where you have more within the light spectrum, more within that range, you typically have less resolution, so less detail. And when we think about resolution and detail, I'll take you through a few examples of what that looks like. Because again, this is a concept that comes up quite often. But what we typically hear about with satellite data is that satellite data is available at a 30 centimeter resolution. So what that means is that we get a pixel or a signal back representing every 30 centimeters on the Earth. However, that doesn't mean we can pick out an object that's 30 centimeters in size. What we tend to think in the Earth observation and in the satellite sort of world is that you have to have 4 pixels together to have a certain amount of confidence in what you're seeing. So actually what that means is that the smallest object we can detect is 60 by 60 centimeters. And that's with what we call a panchromatic black and white image. When we think back to that previous slide and the trade-offs we're getting, we actually get this this imagery with all of that spectral information in often comes at a lower level of detail, so a lower resolution. So there's a lot of things we have to consider when we're thinking about what we can detect and see in satellite data. And just to sort of conceptualize that, here's a few examples from interesting papers that we've seen. And it just gives you a feel for the kind of information and level of detail that you can get. So what we're seeing in the middle here is a drone image that's something around about 2 centimeter resolution. So that gives you a feel. We can pick out individual flower heads within that, for example. Over on the right hand side, we actually have a 30 meter resolution satellite image. So that's a pixel every 30 meters. And it has been used in this case to pick out wildflowers in this plain in the USA because of the distinctive color of those wildflowers. So we can detect those because they're very distinctive and they stand out even at that very low resolution. And again, this is just a really nice example that's come from a paper in Central America, looking at what you tend to see with different resolutions and different levels of detail. So actually, the data that I'll come to talk about a little bit more that we're applying is on the far right-hand side here. So it's this Sentinel-2 satellite data that's got a 10 meter pixel resolution. So another thing to consider when you're thinking about using satellite data is accuracy. So what you tend to have within your mobile phone, everyone has a GPS within that, and that has a certain level of accuracy within it. So it's telling you your location, but that's incorrect. It's your location is actually somewhere within a 5 meter radius approximately of where you are with your mobile phone. So there's some error within that. And that actually translates into the satellite data. So what we typically see with very high resolution satellite data is that it has an error of roughly 5 meters. That's about as good as you can get from a satellite. It's an error of 5 meters. And it's just worth saying that it's worth being very careful when you're thinking about picking out individual objects that are close to each other, making sure that you understand which object you're actually seeing in the satellite image because of that error that's inherently within there. So I've given a really rapid run through of several topics just to give an understanding of some of the limitations of satellite data, but I think it's worth thinking around where satellites fit with other data sources. So this is where we see satellites fitting with other data sources of remote sensing data. And I think the point here is that over on the left, where you have aerial survey or drone survey, you can achieve a really high level of detail with those. But the trade-off is that you have to pay a lot more for those. You cover a much smaller area, and you have issues around mobilizing the drone or the aerial survey to actually capture that data. So there's certainly a place for all of that within the workflow. Absolutely a place for that within the workflow. Dan's already talked about this. but there's also a place for satellites. The point being that you have to understand all of these trade-offs, and you have to understand all of these different things to consider when you're thinking about deploying satellite data. So again, a schematic that we've generated here, just to give you an idea of what data should I use? You know, how should I go about making some decisions with when do I use satellite data? And I think the key point here is that if you've got multiple disparate sites, and whether you're interested in monitoring or one-off, you should consider satellites. So one-off satellite surveys are advantageous because they allow the same point in time or a similar point in time to be considered. So there's a place where satellites are useful, and there's a place where they aren't, and where you may consider using a drone survey, or indeed even an ecologist on the ground. But we wanted to put this together to kind of give an understanding of when that might be. So very quickly, before we move on to answer some questions, I want to talk a little bit about the approach we're taking and where we're fitting into the biodiversity net gain workflow. So when we think about how biodiversity is measured within the DEFRA metric calculator, there are several things that are measured which go in to inform biodiversity units. So we have to understand habitat size, habitat distinctiveness, strategic significance, and habitat condition. And the area that we've focused on with satellites within Map Impact so far is actually in habitat condition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides, and then show an example before I finish. But before we understand habitat condition, we have to understand habitats. And what we're doing within Map Impact is using what we're calling best available habitat data. So Dan already mentioned several sources of satellite data that are available. We've taken several of those amongst other data, so amongst other openly available data, and we've brought all that together to create a nationwide best available habitat layer based on that open source data. Map Impact, it's worth saying Map Impact are a UK hub partner. So what we're doing is trying to align everything as much as we can with the UK hub classification system. We're also very, very keen as an organisation to support that system and what it's trying to achieve, and have open conversations about where satellites and remote sensing can fit into that system and where it can't. But the point here is, when we're gathering this best available open source data, we're then interpreting that to fit in with UK Hab as best as possible. So when we come on to think about condition, again, Dan's already alluded to this, but condition is highly complex. Many of you on the call will already know this, but it's incredibly difficult to actually understand the condition of a specific habitat type. So the example I've chosen here on the right is grassland. And all these annotations are essentially saying, well, maybe there are ways that we could use satellite and remote sensing data to try to support some of these condition statements, or some of the things we understand with condition. And what we end up with in the end is a high-level category of good, moderate, or poor for condition. And that's really important because it's then used as a multiplier to inform the overall biodiversity net gain and biodiversity unit score. And I think this schematic here summarizes the importance of condition really well. So we've just highlighted within here a few different habitat types, but just to show the difference that condition can make. So particularly if we take something like the top line here, where we've got meadow, that can have a score of 8. But then if that's in good condition, it can be multiplied by 3 and become a score of 24. So it can really change the habitat unit score depending on what the condition score is within the calculator. So we think it's a really important thing to consider and understand. So what do we do? How do we go about producing what we do and feed into the biodiversity net gain workflow? Well, we take our habitat data sets that I've already mentioned, we prioritize those based on importance, and that gives us a distinctiveness score because each habitat is automatically assigned a distinctiveness score. The part where satellite imagery comes into play is that we're using satellite imagery to take each of those sections of habitat and understand them from above. So we're looking at understanding how well they're performing, essentially using the indices that I described a bit earlier on. So the spectral indices and that spectral wavelength, we're using lots of characteristics within that to understand how each habitat is performing. And the interesting thing about that light wavelength is that it should be applied differently depending on what the habitat type is. So we know a woodland performs very differently to a grassland, for example, and that means that we can use different parts of that satellite light spectrum in order to understand those two habitats in different ways. So we're taking all of that into account, and we're then comparing how a certain habitat is performing in one location with all of the equivalent habitats in the surroundings. We're using a process that we call benchmarking. And in the end, that comes up with a condition score, which is assigned to the habitat. Now, everything we're doing is working in hexagon grids, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. There's a variety of different reasons why we're using hexagons. Ecologically, they're a very, very good way of presenting this sort of data because they allow many more neighbors than a square would, which means you can show much more natural shapes within the outputs that you create. They're also highly efficient from a technology point of view. So the hexagon system that we use covers the whole Earth. It was created by Uber, and it's a highly efficient data model that we're applying this information to. So it has some really good advantages using the hexagons. So in terms of all of that, that's all great from the satellite, but actually what we're really focusing on is making sure that what we're doing is tying to reality and making sure that we're ground truthing what we're doing and that we're actually calibrating those satellite signals, but also using ground truthing to understand the accuracy of what we're getting from a satellite. So this is an example of one of the sites that was visited earlier this year. So we've been performing field surveys in many locations throughout this year in order to help to calibrate what we're doing and validate what we're doing. And this was a Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust site that was visited. So what's actually happened here, there was a walk through the site, a biodiversity net gain condition survey was done by the ecologist, and the condition scores assigned as well as the habitat. So we're able to take this information and use this to help inform what we're seeing in the satellite data and make sure that's correct. So all of this has led to us actually launching a nationwide service. So these hexagons that we're seeing here on the screen, we have those for every 50 meters. So there's a hexagon for every 50 meters covering the whole country. And each hexagon has a biodiversity unit score assigned to it, as well as a habitat and a biodiversity condition score. So what this is allowing us to do is provide a really rapid early stage screening of what's going on at a particular site. So to inform biodiversity from a really early stage at the site. And we're producing, or we're actually getting these out to people into the marketplace in these reports. So we've teamed up with Landmark Information Group, and we're providing this data through them to a variety of different customers, but for example, landowners, developers, and many others. And the idea of this is that you receive a very, very quick and rapid understanding of the site that you're interested in. And where this is useful is that this gives you an understanding of what habitats you've got on the site and how those particular habitats are performing, which can help with some decision making. It can help with decision making about what happens with biodiversity net gain on that site and how that works, but it can also help to really screen out sites that you think might not be worth developing. Equally, it can help the ecologists really focus on where they need to visit in a site or in multiple sites. So the idea is that it's a very, very early rapid screening assessment that's delivered. And the habitats detail within here. We also provide the habitat quality overview of the site. So this equates to condition and just shows an indication of how the site is performing in general. So all of this is about early stage decision making in the workflow to inform further work. So coming back to before I finish, is coming back to my first point again, and again emphasising what a point that Dan made earlier on. Satellites are not the only answer. They're a tool in the box, but there are many other tools that they need to be used alongside. So what I'm very, very conscious of doing is not saying that satellites are the way forward with biodiversity net gain. They are one of the things that can fit into the biodiversity net gain workflow, but they require many other pieces of technology to make them work, and they require field visits to make sure that they're used in the right way. So hopefully in a really rapid run through, I've covered many topics there, but hopefully I've given you a flavour of what the limitations are of satellites as an environmental data source. I've shown you some ideas of the scenarios where satellites might be useful and might not be useful, and I've given you a quick run through of how we're using satellites within the biodiversity net gain workflow. So that's the end from me. Thank you.